Thank you, David. The formal name of my chair, when I was recruited to Harvard, I was told I would get the Charles Burgess McGrath Chair of Medical Ethics. And then I got this formal thing from the Board of Trustees saying, you have been appointed the Francis Glessner Lee Chair of Legal Medicine. And I said, there seems to have been some mistake here. And apparently, there's a long story to explain how. But I said, well, I don't really do legal medicine. Don't do illegal medicine. But and they said, well, we had one other problem like this. If to change the name of a chair, you have to go to the state legislature in Massachusetts. So we told the person who had, Howard Hyatt, used to be the dean of the School of Public Health, we told him, just call it whatever you want. So I call it the Chair of Medical Ethics, even though formally it's legal medicine. So that has nothing to do...
The forward arrow on the keyboard?
Yeah, okay.
That'll do you well.
Let me tell you how this talk and the paper that it's based on came about. I've worked on issues about that arise in the context of genetic testing and genetic enhancement for a while now, and I've written several papers. So there'll be some issues that you may want to talk about that I won't say anything about. Feel free in discussion to raise them. I'm happy to talk about others. But this paper, and in turn the talk, came about because at a working group research project on disability, I used a variant of a case of Derek Parfit's, a philosopher at Oxford. And the case was this. A woman's told that if she gets pregnant now, she's almost certain to have a child who is seriously mentally retarded. But if she simply waits 2 months, takes a simple medication with no known side effects, there's every reason to believe she'll have a normal child. Now, my view is, and was at that time, still is, that it would be wrong for her not to take the medication, wait, and 2 months to get pregnant, with the expectation then that she would have a normal child as opposed to a seriously mentally disabled child. But one of the people in this working group to whom I made this presentation argued not just that it would be permissible for her not to wait and take the medication, but that it would be wrong to wait and take the medication in order to have a normal child. And the reason that was offered was that doing so would be selection, and selection of children was wrong. Now, that view seemed to me deeply implausible then. It seems to me deeply implausible now. But what it started me thinking about was a view that is more widely held, that there's something wrong with selecting and trying to control the nature of our children. So thus this paper came into being. I'll talk about two kinds of selection. Negative, which is selection to try, like in the Parfit case I just gave you, selection to try to avoid a trait that's believed to be undesirable, and that's mostly going to be disease conditions causing significant disability, Huntington's disease, a whole host of other diseases for which we can now do genetic testing to determine the likelihood of the potential child having the disease, and so-called positive selection, where one's selecting for traits that are believed to be desirable. And I'm going to include within that, as you'll see, genetic manipulation to try to create a positive trait and or to make it more beneficial. And so that maps up pretty closely with what's usually called negative and positive eugenics. And I will come later on to the criticism of this whole enterprise, that it's eugenics and eugenics is wrong. But first, how am I understanding selection? Well, I'm understanding it as any decision of prospective parents that's intended to affect the nature of the child that will be born. Now, that's a wide conception of it, deliberately so. So, for example, in some cases, a choice of a procreative partner may in part be motivated by the thought that this partner is going to be a good earner, and that'll produce a good early environment for the child, or this partner has some genetic traits that are likely to give the child whatever traits you want the child to have. Now, it would be pretty odd if someone chose a partner mainly or entirely on grounds that it was going to pass on good genetic traits to the progeny. I certainly never chose any of my wives that way, and I wouldn't want to be chosen by a partner for that reason, but certainly that's one of the reasons sometimes that people choose procreative partners. Engaging in healthy behavior during pregnancy is also designed to affect the nature of the child that will be born. Avoiding alcohol use, avoiding smoking, healthy diets, so forth and so on. And I'd emphasize that one's not talking here just about choice between existing children. The Sophie's choice was a choice of which child will live and which child will die among existing children. But one is in the different contexts that I'll be talking about, in preconception selection, what one's talking about there is genetic testing that is done before conception to determine the likelihood of passing on certain genetic diseases. So, for example, testing to see whether potential parents have the gene for Tay-Sachs and so forth. There, what one's doing is choosing between possible children. No conception has yet taken place, and one's trying to make it the case that one possible child will be the one that's conceived as opposed to another possible child. In post-conception selection, the choice is between a fetus, which in my view is a non-person, but nevertheless a human being. So a non-person fetus versus, again, another possible person, because, at least usually another possible person, because typically abortion for serious genetic conditions is followed by an attempt to have an unaffected child. So typically it involves that kind of substitution. PGD, prenatal genetic diagnosis. I do know what it means. PGD is selection of two entities. Now, you can decide what kind of entities they are and what kind of moral standing you think they have, but a selection of two embryos on the basis typically of some feature of one embryo but not the other, sometimes sex selection, but increasingly in the future it'll be on the basis of other conditions. Right now it's mostly to avoid an embryo carrying a particular disease. And then finally I include in this a genetic manipulation of the embryo in order to select certain properties. Now, by and large, that simply isn't possible now. And there's a lot of dispute about when, if ever, it will be possible. In particular, with regard to positive selection, there's a real question whether the traits that we're interested in, likely to be interested in selecting, may not be so complex that we'll never understand them well enough to be able to do the kind of manipulations to select for them. Back when I worked on a book in this area with some other colleagues, we got a grant from ELSI, and since the four of us authors were all philosophers, we put into the grant a board of scientific advisors to keep us from making really dumb mistakes about the science. And Richard Lewontin was one of them, was one of the smartest people I know. And he has this view that we'll never be able to do these kinds of manipulations of the kinds of traits we'd really be interested in, like intelligence or other character traits. That's an open question. I don't know the answer to that. I don't think anyone does. The common moral concern here, I think, is with choosing or taking control over the nature of the children we have, over what kind of children we have. And that makes a lot more people uneasy than just the person from the disability rights movement who responded to the Parfit case in the way I suggested. So what I'm after in this talk is to try to explore that uneasiness, see if there's good reason for it. Is genetic selection special as opposed to other selection? Philosophers are notorious for not giving you unambiguous answers, so I thought I'd offer you one early on in the talk. And the answer is no. Now, sometimes, of course, genetic selection may be special if one's selecting for or against genes that have great phenotypic import. For example, Tay-Sachs disease. On the other hand, the so-called junk genes that don't seem to have any phenotypic effect, of which there are an awful lot of such genes, wouldn't be any real reason to select for or against them, I think, in nearly all cases. But if one did, one wouldn't think that that selection was special. It would be special if two things were true, neither of which is true. Genetic selection would be special, selection for genetic particular genes, if some strong version of genetic determinism was true. And why it would be special then was because if some strong version of genetic determinism, on the basis of which your genes were going to determine all your phenotypic traits, if that were true, then there would be a very strong kind of control that came from genetic selection. But as we know, there's no reason to believe in any strong version of genetic determinism of that sort. It also might be special if genetic selection determined the child's identity. One might have the view, one might not too, but one might have the view that choosing the child's identity wasn't something the parent should be engaged in. But what's wrong here is that genetic selection needn't determine identity. Identity, not in the philosopher's sense of numerical identity, but in the sense of what kinds of traits make us the person we are. What are the important traits that make us who we are and how we're different from someone else? Those are going to be phenotypic traits. They're not genetic traits. If someone had manipulated your genes while you were an embryo and gave you green eyes instead of blue eyes, you wouldn't have thought that your identity was changed in any fundamental way. So I think there isn't a reason. That's the clearest answer I'll give you, by the way, is the no. There isn't reason to think that genetic selection is special. So let me turn first to negative selection. The decision not to have a useful distinction here is the distinction between a decision not to have any child, say any child now, versus a distinction not to have this particular child. And the worry about selection is not with regard to the former. That's just a decision someone makes when they decide to use contraception or when they decide to abort. They don't want to have any child now. They decide they're too young or they're not ready or whatever. It's the decision not to have this particular child because of something about this particular child that generates the worries here. And that's going to be because of the likely properties of the child. Typically, that decision will be coupled by an intent to substitute, and I put scare quotes around it, a normal child. That is, a child that isn't likely to have the negative trait in question, isn't likely to have the disease, for example, that's genetically transmitted. Now, alternatively, it could be, and this is the harder case, which I'll talk about both these in a moment, it could be a decision that I would, the prospective mother or both parents could say, I'd rather have no child at all than to have a child with this condition. And that's, of course, then not substituting. That's saying we're not going to have any child if this is the kind of child we would have. And both of these are bothersome to many people, worrisome, because they seem to express a fairly strong negative attitude with regard to the disability. with regard to the child who would have it. You don't want to have a child that would have that disability. And to people with it. And so people with the disabilities in question that are being selected against say, here's the message you're sending, that it would be better if I had never been born. And one can understand that if that is the message, that could seem both a threatening message and a offensive message to persons who have the disability. And I'm going to put some focus in this talk on that expressive issue. One reason one might hold that negative selection is wrong has nothing to do with the expression. It's just that it would be directly harmful to persons who exist with the same disability. People with the disability who exist with that disability in society. So, for example, if the selection was against persons who would have Down syndrome, then the argument is selecting against them is harmful to people in our society who have Down syndrome. Apparently, 90% of women who get a positive test for Down syndrome subsequently abort. Now, that's kind of a misleading statistic because people who know they wouldn't abort for that aren't likely to get tested for it. But nevertheless, that is the common outcome. So why might it be directly harmful? Well, one version of this argument is that it could erode the social support for persons who exist with that disability. I heard someone make another, in my view, implausible claim at a recent conference on these issues that of just this sort, that we shouldn't abort against children with Down syndrome because that will reduce social services for people who already have it. So that was a direct harm kind of argument. A person turned to me as we left after hearing that talk, and she said, "Did I hear what I just thought I heard?" And then she said this. Why is that morally problematic? Well, it uses some people without their consent and in ways that are harmful to them for the benefit of others. It's saying, we're going to create you with a condition that makes your life more difficult because that will be beneficial to others who exist with that condition. Usually we think that using people against their wishes and in harmful ways, or without their consent and in harmful ways, is morally problematic. A different version of the direct harm is to say that the attitude expressed here is directly harmful or hurtful to disabled persons. So it causes them psychological distress, for example. And a third version of this argument is to argue that in various ways society benefits from the presence of disabled persons in it, from their contributions, from our being more tolerant of diversity, so forth and so on. And so there's a broader social harm if one selects against these conditions. Now, I'm not going to focus on these. I've already indicated what I think about the first argument. I think the degree to which it's hurtful to disabled persons is probably not serious, and I think in other contexts I've argued that most of the benefits that come to society from disabled persons could have come from persons who aren't disabled, and so that's not the only way to get those benefits. So let me look at the expressivist, what I'll call the expressivist objection. Here's the putative message. I've already said what the putative message is here. What's believed to be the message is that the lives of disabled persons are of lesser value than the lives of non-disabled persons. And in the strongest version of the message, that at least in ways I've heard it, the message that disabled persons should never have been born. And as I say, it's easy to see why that could be threatening to someone with the disability in question. So I want to examine whether that, what would follow if that was the message, and also whether that is the message. If one asked what's the intended message, for example, by someone who let's take preconception genetic testing. If what's the intended message, I think the answer probably is, in many cases, none. The person's just trying to have a healthy child, doesn't intend any message to be sent to anybody. And if there is a message that's sent, it looks like that I simply want to have, I'm telling you by what I'm doing that I want to have a healthy child. And that's why I'm engaging in the testing and what's, for example, substitution. So the intended message can't be what's really at stake here. But suppose that the putative message was the message. Would that justify restricting selection, not making it possible for people to do it? And again, I forgot I had another clear answer for you here. No. Because doing so would violate, I think, two fairly well-recognized moral and uncontroversial moral and legal rights. One fairly obvious, the other not so obvious. It's commonly accepted that there's some kind of right to reproductive freedom or procreative liberty. That includes a right to terminate, and this is both in the law and in most moral thinking on this, a right to terminate a pregnancy, and without, at least in the early stages of that pregnancy, without an assessment of how good the person's reasons are. So if we don't judge reasons for early abortion, it would seem as if that same right would cover the decision to select either preconception or postconception. Now, the other interesting, when I started thinking about this, the other interesting thing, right that would be violated here is the right to freedom of expression. Why would that be violated if one restricted selection on these grounds? Because one was restricting it on the basis of the message expressed. That was the reason for the restriction, and that's why it would violate the right to freedom of expression. Freedom of expression protects offensive messages, messages that are found offensive by others. So, in terms of the policy implications, even if the putative message is in fact the message, it wouldn't justify restricting this practice. But what is the message? And in particular, what's the message that's reasonably implied in the practice? Whether or not it's the message that's intended by the person who undertakes selection. Well, there are three kinds of cases here. One is I've already indicated what they are. One is the preconception case, where, for example, two persons thinking of conceiving undergo genetic testing to see, for example, what likelihood they might have of passing on Tay-Sachs disease, a particularly devastating disease. What's the message that is implied in doing this? That is, what would others reasonably infer the message to be from persons engaging in this practice, or for society endorsing this practice? Well, one potential message is just that these parents, potential parents, want to give their child the best life possible. And they judge, in the Tay-Sachs case, quite reasonably that it is not the best life possible to have Tay-Sachs disease, but the same thing would be true of much less serious diseases. A second thing that you could reasonably infer, I think, is that a serious disability is likely to make a child's life more difficult or worse. That is, that it's likely to be a disadvantage. Now, of course, we know that's not going to be true in all the cases. There'll be some cases in which having had a disability, not as serious as Tay-Sachs, but for example, blindness or other disabilities, serve to enrich a person's life, serve to build character strengths they wouldn't otherwise have built, and so forth and so on. And we can say in some particular cases, this person's life is better than it would have been if they hadn't had that disability. Or we can also say, this person's life is better than otherwise similar persons who don't have a disability. That's perfectly compatible with the claim here that a serious disability is likely to make a child's life more difficult or worse. Because at the point at which a parent undertakes selection, they have to undertake it on the basis of what is the likely effect of the disease. They don't know what the effect of the condition will be on this child once this child lives with that. Another message is that the parents simply believe that having a child with this condition would create burdens for their family that they're not able or willing to undertake. And that doesn't say anything about what the life for the child from a subjective standpoint is like. That just says the effects of the child on the rest of our family are such that we don't want to undertake those burdens. Now, what I think here is that there's no implication then, no necessary implication, about what the value of a disabled life would be to the child who has that disabled life, nor is there any necessary message about the value of that disabled life to the broader, of that child to the broader society. There's no message in particular with regard to the moral status of that child if the child is born with the disability, or for that matter any other disabled child. So let me turn to the post-conception case. If potential parents, a pregnant woman believes her fetus is a full moral person with all the moral protections against being killed that you and I have, then it would be wrong to select by aborting, and she shouldn't, but I think almost certainly she wouldn't. Someone who has that view isn't likely to undergo genetic testing in most cases, and certainly even if she did, not likely to abort because she's going to think that would be no different than killing one of her born children. But the problem here, notice, is abortion, not selection. So that's what the moral problem is. So suppose she believes, as I think many people do, that the fetus, there's what that prelude to was the third case. So suppose she believes that the fetus has no significant moral status. If she believes that, then selecting against it is going to be just like selecting in the preconception case, where there's no entity that yet exists that has any moral standing, and here she believes there's also the case there's no entity that exists that has any moral standing. So the more likely case is if she believes the fetus has some moral status. This is the people who have sort of a gradualist view about the acquisition of moral status through conception to pregnancy, not conception to birth. She believes it has some moral status. It deserves some respect. It's not simply like another piece of tissue, but it doesn't have a full right to life of the sort that you and I have. What's the message here then? I think the message is something like this, that the disadvantage that's avoided is sufficiently important to outweigh whatever is deserved by way of respect by that fetus. I've argued in a different context in thinking about stem cell research that one can make sense of respecting embryos as having some kind of intermediate moral status and nevertheless destroying them. So it isn't the case, as some assume, that, well, if embryos have some moral significance, then surely you can't deliberately destroy them. I'll defend that in discussion if you would like. So the message here, I think, is that the disadvantage that's avoided is sufficiently important to outweigh whatever it is that's deserved by way of respect by this entity with something like intermediate moral status, something between none and what we have. The third case is the hardest one, I think. This is a case of a person who prefers to have no child than to have one with this disability. Now that might be the case, for example, if they learn from testing that any child that they would have would likely have the condition in question. What's the reasonable message implied in this case? Well, it's not the case that what's implied reasonably is that the child's life wouldn't be worth living. And of course that's a core message that the disability community objects to here. That's true in very few cases. It may be true in Tay-Sachs disease, Leishmanian disease. I'm not sure there are any other plausible cases where the condition is both consistent with life itself and, on the other hand, so bad that it makes the life, from the standpoint of the child, such that it's not worth living. It would have been better if from the child's standpoint if it had never been born. Most all the other conditions that we can test for don't meet that standard. It's also the case here that I'm assuming that that fetus doesn't have any right to be born. If it had the full moral standing with regard to being killed that you and I have, then it would have a right to be born from the fact that otherwise it wouldn't be likely to do so it would have the right not to be killed to make it not be born. So the message here again could just be that it would be better for her family not to have this child. Now suppose that's the reasoning that goes on in with many people who have this attitude. Nothing follows about the moral status of the child that she would have. Nothing need follow that suppose I did it. Nothing need follow that I would think it would be better for Mark's family not to have a child like this, or for Dave's family not to have a child like this. All she may think is that for my family, given our circumstances, it would be better for us not to have this child. So in all three cases, here's what I want to claim. There need be no message that the child's life must turn out to be worse than the life of, scare quotes, normal persons. That's not true. It's only a likelihood. There's no message entailed that the child's life wouldn't be valuable for it. In fact, one would grant that it would be in almost all cases. There's no message implied that the child wouldn't be of value to society. There's no message that no other person who has this disability should have been born. If I believe it's just my family that it wouldn't be good for, I don't have to believe that it would be bad for your family. And in particular, there's no message reasonably implied that disabled persons don't have an important moral right to something like equal concern and respect. And as a part of that, a right to claims against social resources necessary, for example, to assure them something like reasonable opportunity. Now, so that's what I think is reasonably implied, and I think those messages aren't then morally problematic. Some are still going to mistakenly infer a hurtful message, which could have harmful consequences for them. And that's not just a hypothetical possibility, that's a reality, I think. So what should we say about that? Well, one thing to say is, well, try to clarify the message so they understand that the mistaken inference they draw from the practice, which they believe is humiliating or hurtful to them, they understand that isn't the message in the practice. But one won't be able to successfully do that in all cases. So one does have a consequentialist reason, pardon the jargon, one does have a consequentialist reason to want to avoid that hurtful consequence of the message, the harmful consequence. But if one can't clarify the message, then does the harm justify not selecting? And I think in almost all cases the answer to that's no. Because if one says it doesn't justify, it justifies not selecting, what that means is that it would have to justify what's almost in all cases a greater harm, namely forcing an unwanted child on a woman. Because that's what happens if she's not able to select, whereas otherwise she would have been able to. It also results in children with a worse life, other things equal, than the children that she could have had if she had substituted the normal child for the disabled child. So let me turn to positive selection, rather than avoid traits we don't like, trying to get traits we do think are beneficial. As I've already mentioned, this is less feasible now, and I think in the future than negative selection. Negative selection sometimes is for example, so-called single-gene diseases like Huntington's disease, one of the early diseases for which we had a genetic test, and one can determine with almost certainty whether the child will have the disease. In the kinds of traits that we would want to positively select for, kinds of traits we'd like to ensure that our children have, or have to a greater degree, they're going to be very complex traits. They will be multigenic traits with lots of gene-gene interactions, gene-environment interactions, and they may be sufficiently complex that we'll never understand them well enough to select for them. They will certainly be harder to identify for selection using PGD. Right now, sometimes we can use PGD, preconception genetic diagnosis. You see, I do know what it means. Sometimes we can use that to select against disease. Sometimes it's used for sex selection. Not very often in this country, but in some other countries more often. So it's going to be much harder to manipulate the genes to get the phenotypic outcome one's concerned with in positive selection. Because one doesn't really care about the genes for themselves, one cares about the genes for the phenotypic effect they're expected to have. Is there a harmful message in positive selection? Well, the message, suppose what one's trying to select for is intelligence or some aspect of intelligence, or memory or some aspect of memory. Well, what's the message in doing that? Well, one message is it's better to have higher intelligence than lower intelligence, or it's better to have a better memory than a worse memory. My wife has a better memory than I do. I've always envied her for it. And that suggests the view that it would be better to have a better memory. Now, what should we say about this message? Is there a negative message in this? Well, that less intelligent persons lack a desirable trait, or persons with poor memories lack a desirable condition or trait. Is that hurtful to the less intelligent, or to those of us without as good a memory as my wife has? Well, it's interesting to note here a couple of things. The message doesn't really come from the selection, of course. The message that comes from the underlying value judgment that it's desirable to have more rather than less intelligence, or it's desirable to have a better rather than worse memory. Whether or not selection took place, it's the value judgment which sends the message, right? And the selection is just a means of sending that the message of the underlying value judgment. Now, my view of the value judgment there is true. It is better to, we can put qualifications on this and argue about it if you'd like, but it is better to have more rather than less intelligence. And it is better to have a better rather than a worse memory. These are what Rawls would have called natural primary goods. That is, they're properties that are useful to us in carrying out almost any plan of life that we might choose to carry out. It's not to say they're necessary in carrying out any plan of life, but it's to say that other things equal, they're beneficial in carrying out nearly any plan of life. Could we avoid these underlying value judgments which would send this message? Well, I think, A, we wouldn't want to avoid them because if we believe they're true, which I do, but B, we couldn't avoid them in any case. How could we stop people from believing that it was better to be more rather than less intelligent, or to have a good memory but rather than not? I'd add here, well, I won't take up that last point unless you want to in discussion. Now, I'm going to briefly, in the rest of the talk, go over several other arguments that one hears in this, in these debates, in this literature against selection. None of them, in my view, are persuasive. So one is simply that selection involves playing God, and maybe God can play God, but we're not supposed to. I'd note that this objection applies just as much to selecting against diseases as it does selecting positive traits. And so if you are impressed with this objection, you should worry about people trying to avoid disease. I, in fact, think it also applies to much of what medicine does. But the fundamental problem here is that if what's being objected to is interference in natural processes in the way that maybe is God's purview but not ours, then what does it apply to? It's terribly difficult to see what counts as playing God and what doesn't. We weren't meant to fly, but we invented airplanes, and so now we do fly. We invented cars, and so now we get around in ways that we couldn't have otherwise. God gave us the capacities to do those things if one believes they came from God. If that's the case, God gave us the capacities to understand genetics and to develop PGD, and gave us the capacities to select. So I think it's just notoriously difficult to tell how to apply this objection. Now, some of us would say, well, we don't think, well, let me make this point with the next. Public policy, in my view, also, even if one thought there was something messy about playing God here, public policy shouldn't, in my view, impose a particular religious view, playing God, on the entire society, some of which believe that this isn't playing God, some of us believe that there isn't a God, and so we're not taking his role or her role. So this objection, I think, doesn't get one very far. This is one that has gotten a lot of attention. It's an argument that Leon Cass has made. It's an argument that Michael Sandel has made. Argument that Bill May has made. It's an argument that the President's Council for Bioethics has made. The idea is that children should be viewed as a gift, and one can put this in secular terms, not a gift of God, but children should be viewed as a gift, accepted as they are, that it's important in the raising of children that they be unconditionally loved and accepted by their parents, and that selection is in some sense incompatible with that important psychological attitude. As Sandel has put it, selection involves, in the extreme form, a tyrannical desire for control over the nature of our children. Those of us who are parents know that if you think you're going to do that, you're in for a lot of disappointments. But nevertheless, here the idea is it isn't something you should be trying to do, not just because you'll fail, but because that isn't the kind of relationship between parents and children that leads to the development of healthy children. Unconditional love and acceptance of children is important for healthy child rearing. And I want to just accept that claim. And I will accept also that disappointment is certainly likely with positive selection, in part because positive selection, because it's much more complex than the negative selection, say, for single gene diseases, because it's much more complex, it's going to fail more often, or it's going to have unintended consequences that we didn't anticipate. I'd note that I think, in fact, this worry applies even more strongly to negative selection. In negative selection, it could be argued that children are being viewed something like commodities, and you get to return them to the return desk if they're defective. So what's happening is you're saying, send this one back, I don't want it because it's going to be blind, or it's going to have this particular disease. Now, of course, there is no return desk, but the point is that it seems like that to people. So the crucial issue here, in my view, is will the use of selection undermine this attitude? I'm accepting that this attitude of, in some form, unconditional love and acceptance is important to healthy child rearing. Will it undermine that attitude? That's an empirical question. We don't really know the answer to it. I think there are at least some reasons to think it's unlikely. That attitude is common across a wide range of societies and over a wide range of historical circumstances. That suggests it's probably quite deeply genetically imprinted in our brains. in which case it's not going to be so easily gotten rid of by a new practice of this sort. It's also the case that selection occurs before the child is born, in some cases even before the child is conceived. Pregnancy and child rearing with the child that you're going to have still will be roughly like it is now, with a couple qualifications needed. And the bonding process that occurs, for example, between a woman and her child during pregnancy, and between both a husband and a wife with the child after it's born, all that process is going to be pretty much like it was before. So that process, to the extent that that's what triggers or creates this unconditional love and acceptance, that process is still going to take place and still should trigger it. And we also know that parents right now do things to try to shape their children. Sometimes they go too far in that. But all of us have hopes for what our children will be like. It would be odd, to say the least, if parents had no hopes for their children, just said, well, I don't care what they turn out to be like. So we have all those hopes now, and we don't think it seriously erodes unconditional love and acceptance. So I think there isn't a good reason to think that that attitude will be undermined. I should be able to finish up just about at 1, and we can open it up. Another objection that one hears here is that selection is misplaced perfectionism. It assumes that there's a perfect child and that that's what we should be aiming at, or at least that's what we are going to aim at. And the argument, again, all of us who are parents know that in practice certainly there isn't any perfect child. At least I don't know of anyone who's ever had one. But I want to argue there's no assumption that there's even an ideal notion of a perfect child here. Selection doesn't assume this kind of perfectionism. It doesn't assume very much at all. It assumes only that we could know that there are some things that would be likely to make a child's life better than it otherwise would have been. That is, that there's some interventions, if we could do them, or some selections among alternative embryos, that if some properties exist or don't exist, it would make a child's life likely better than it would have been with or without those properties. So all it requires is that we believe that we can know that some things would likely make a given child's life better. And we do know this. I think we believe we know this, and I think we do know this. We know this with regard to serious disease and disability, that if a child's life was without that disease or disability, it would likely be better than it would be with it. Doesn't entail that necessarily it would be better, only that it would likely be. And certainly for natural primary goods like intelligence, memory, capacity to focus on a task, and so forth, which I think of as all-purpose means useful. Is that mine? Well, if you'll just tolerate it, it'll stop. Sorry. I don't know who the hell...
Sorry, Professor Brock, your time is up.
Now I'm going to have to chastise whoever that is. Yeah, sorry. There you go. There you go. Apologies. I wish whoever it was would have turned off their cell phone. Sorry. So for natural primary goods that we would attempt to select for in positive selection, they're all-purpose means that are useful in nearly any life. And so we can know that it's good for children to have more intelligence, better memories, better capacities for focusing on tasks, and so forth. Also, it's the case that if we accept reasonable pluralism about what a good life is, which we should accept, that there isn't any one version of what's the best life or the best kind of person, then we accept that there are different reasonable views about what a good life will be, and there are different reasonable views about what a good person would be. And when we act on those different reasonable views, it doesn't assume that we know which life is best. The hard issue here is how far this reasonable pluralism should extend. The case that's been most discussed is selecting for a deaf child. There was a lesbian couple in Washington who sought to and did select to use pre-implantation genetic diagnosis to select for, they were both deaf, so to select for a child that would be deaf. And I think what the controversy is here is in the deaf community, it's often claimed that the deaf are not disabled, they're differently abled. They have a language, they have a culture, the deaf culture, so it's a different language, it's a different culture, and so they are differently abled but not disabled, and that's a claim that's made specifically with regard to deafness. Now the question, of course, is with regard to how far this reasonable pluralism should extend, of how plausible that claim is. Is deafness a disability, where what follows from that is that it's expected to be a disadvantage, or are the deaf merely differently abled? I'm not going to, I'll tell you my view is that it is a disability and a disadvantage. Certainly some of the disadvantage is socially constructed. That is, it's because the society is structured in certain ways that it shouldn't be, and we could accommodate further persons with this impairment, hearing impairment, and then it would be less of a disadvantage. The question is the entire disadvantage socially constructed? And in my view, it's not in the case of deafness. Even more clearly, in my view, not in the case of blindness. Those would still be disadvantages even if we did everything that we thought should be done to make society just towards persons who are deaf or disadvantaged. Two more arguments, and I'll stop. One is that selection is eugenics, and eugenics is wrong. And it certainly is the case that the Nazis permanently tarred eugenics as wrong. But I think, and so in many cases it's used as a conversation stopper, right, or a discussion stopper. Well, this is eugenics and eugenics is wrong. End of discussion. I think that's wrong. What we need to do is ask what's wrong about eugenics. In the book that I wrote with three other philosophers called From Chance to Choice, Genetics and Justice, we had a chapter in there trying to do that. Here I will only touch on a couple of points, but here are some of the things that were wrong with historic eugenic movements. The Nazis, but also eugenic movements were common from about the 1870s in many parts of Europe and in this country on into the point at which the Nazis permanently discredited it. We used to have, at county fairs in this country, we had fitter family contests, which was essentially the analog to who had the best pig or the best cow, and it was in this case the family. So what were some of the things that were wrong with genetics? Well, a belief in the deterioration of the gene pool. There was a strong belief among eugenicists to that effect. Probably a false belief. Certainly a false belief that most social problems were caused by biology, and so they could be best dealt with by biology. And if they were caused by biology, sometimes it was believed they could only be dealt with by biology. So we didn't have to worry about social interventions to try to deal with many of these social problems. There were pervasive racial, class, ethnic, and nationalist prejudices within the eugenics movement about who was fit to reproduce. People like us is what they usually believed. And there was coercive interference of the state in reproductive choices. And finally, and there's a lot more to be said here, but a willingness to sacrifice interests and rights of some people for the putative greater good of the society. Now the question here with regard to selection in the context that we're encountering it now is, are these evils and mistakes inherent in selection? And all I'll do is claim that it seems to me they are not inherent in the practices that I've been talking about. So the eugenic charge in this discussion requires an independent, it can't be used as a conversation stopper. It can't be used as an argument. It can only be used as a conclusion of an argument which points to the negative features of the practice, that were associated with eugenics, and shows that they still exist now. In my view, they don't. So here's the last point. The risks of selection. For negative selection, it's unclear the risks are even as great as they are with therapeutic medicine, because in negative selection, what happens is the child is never born. Right? You select against that child. So if you think you don't wrong the child by not conceiving it or by not bringing it to term after it's been conceived, then it's not clear what the risks are there. They don't look to be like the risk with therapeutic medicine, where we treat somebody and they already exist and they will continue to exist, we hope, when we treat them. And so we have to worry about the bad consequences of our interventions. For positive selection, the risk is much greater, I think. That's because, in part, the child who's positively enhanced is brought into the world. And so we're going to have to live with our mistakes. And as I've already said several times, the traits that we're attempting to select for will be very complex, and so it won't work as easily as it does in some negative contexts. At present, there's very little positive selection possible. The risks now are excessive. I think there's no reason to believe that in the future they might, at least in some limited contexts, turn out not to be excessive, given the benefits that might come. In any case, the worry about risk is not at the heart of people's uneasiness about selection. So here's the conclusion. I'd emphasize I haven't addressed all the arguments opposing prevention of persons with disabilities or all the arguments about enhancement, but I'm happy to talk about any other ones that I didn't talk about that you want to talk about. I focused mostly on objections that focus particularly on the fact that what's going on here is selection, and that's what we shouldn't be doing. My conclusion is that those objections to selection are not persuasive. And that is the last point. Thank you.
We have time for questions now. I'm going to ask you that you repeat the questions that are asked you, even if they're long, if you summarize them, so that way they'll be web streamed.
Sure.
That way the person will be able to hear them.
All right, so where to start? One is your playing God issue. What bothers me about the playing God thing is that they're claiming their religious basis for that. Religiously, the claim for playing God is judgmentalism.
Just
moral judgments about others' choices. As if you could determine whether they go to hell or not. That sort of thing. And instead, they're applying it to the ways in which human beings might intervene in nature through scientific proceedings, which is a category leap if nothing else. The thing that bothers me is the moral blindness to playing God by those who object to playing God.
Yeah, okay. The question was, it's really, I take the question as really about how one figures out what would count as playing God if one thinks that's something we shouldn't do, and that what in fact people are doing is applying that selectively to the things they don't like, recognizing that in terms of intervening in natural processes and so forth, they don't apply it to things they do like. I hope that's a sort of fair summary of the question.
That's also an issue.
And I think that's dead right. I think that objection really is incoherent. One would have to try to make clear why all the ways in which we have come to be able to intervene in, one would first have to be able to give some account of natural processes, and then one would have to be able to give some account of all the ways that we can intervene in natural processes and make some claim that some kinds of interventions are appropriate for humans to do and others should be left to God. And I suppose someone could try to provide us with a distinction like that. I think the people who make the objection don't really provide us a way of making the distinction between the practices that your comments suggest they do it by whether they approve of the intervention or not. And so I think this is a non-starter. It's also a non-starter because there are lots of people in our society that either don't believe that God restricts what we should be able to do in using our human capacities, and or there are a lot of people in our society who don't believe there is a God. And so if we take this objection as a reason for public policy, we are imposing a particular religious view on the entire society, many of whom don't accept it. Yeah, Mark?
This is a comment. I serve as a consultant from time to time to the National Down Syndrome Society on genetic testing.
Right.
And last year, when the new genetic test for Down syndrome actually was developed, which involves ultrasound and a blood test instead of more invasive measures, there were many people in the Down syndrome world who were very upset about that and very concerned that it would make it too easy to do the genetic test or to do the test for Down syndrome earlier in the pregnancy and facilitate abortion. And they raised many of the arguments that you sketched out, but a couple others that I wanted to make. Number one is that they thought that it would hurt funding for research on Down syndrome if the number of people being born with Down syndrome went down substantially.
That's kind of like the version of the argument, it would hurt the people who already have it.
Right.
Yeah.
And the other one is that it would shift the blame, if you will, from the trisomy, the natural cause, to the parents, as if they could have prevented it, and they didn't, and therefore they should bear some moral blame for the outcome. And so I think it's an interesting development as we contemplate new technologies that will be coming down the road. For example, in the area of Down syndrome testing, it may be possible over the next several years to not only find out whether the fetus is affected or not affected, but the severity of it.
The question is that as the easier and earlier test for Downs has become available, the worry in the Downs community is one that it will be used earlier and more frequently, it'll be easier to use it, and so there'll be more selecting against the disease, fewer individuals than with the disease, and that will reduce research funds for the disease, because research funds do track, at least to some degree, the prevalence of diseases in society, and we probably think that they should track, at least to some degree, the prevalence of disease. And the second point was that
the blame.
Oh, the blame, yes, of course. And that's an argument that's been made ever since the first test became available. Now, on the let me speak to each of those. On the first, suppose it is true. Well, let me give you an analogy. Someone might argue that we should not have campaigns against smoking. Why? Because it will reduce the prevalence of lung cancer, and it will reduce the research funds for lung cancer, and it will reduce the social support for medical research and services for lung cancer. That would be a troubling argument, in my view, because it would say we should let preventable suffering take place, because if we don't, it'll have harmful consequences for third parties. And that is to use people without their consent and in ways that are harmful to them for the benefit of others. Now, and I think, it's also an empirical question whether in fact it will reduce funds for research, or at least for services. If there are fewer persons with Downs, then there'll be fewer social support services needed, and so a smaller amount of money would be adequate to provide them. With regard to research, it might be the case that it would reduce the funds for research, but I think that would be a problematic reason to not permit the continued testing. On the other point, that point was made ever since any of these tests first become available. Before it was just bad luck that your kid had this condition which may be burdensome to you and or to your kid and require extra social supports. Now there's a test available you could have tested and known whether your child would have this condition. So you, that is Mr. and Mrs. Parent, are responsible for having this child when you could have avoided it. And so don't ask us, the larger society, to step in and provide you with the support services that are needed. Now, one thing that's wrong with that, of course, is that the principal person who suffers if those support services aren't available is not the parents, it's the child in question. And certainly the child's claim to necessary support services shouldn't be contingent on whether or not its parents had a choice about whether to bring it into existence. But I think, nevertheless, that is a potential effect. I'm not sure how strong the evidence is that there's been much of an effect of that sort. That is, that, for example, either research or services for Down syndrome, to continue with that example, have really eroded over the period for which that testing has been available. But it is a potential empirical consequence. But even if it was the case, I think it would be morally problematic for the first reason I gave, like the smoker case. Dave?
Well, isn't that as a result, I guess, of the low water mark of HMOs back in the 1980s, when there was that case in California where there was a couple where they were pregnant, had amniocentesis, and they were found to have a CF child. Yes, orbits again. And so the HMO that they were participating with said, we'll be more than happy to pay for the termination, and you will shoulder all the healthcare costs if you go on forward with this child in delivery. And there was such an uproar at that time. I remember back then, I think it was right around when I was doing my fellowship, that so many people came down really hard on that HMO. I think they were really trying to test the water. How far can we push this? Yeah. And it carries through not only the amniocentesis, but any kind of predictive genetic testing as to how things could someday bite us on the butt later on. So the real concern is they were testing how much fault do you bear if you have knowledge, and is it better to not know? Which is why many people say, well, then I'm not going to go ahead and test. I'm not going to evaluate things. But in circumstances for when there is a child in the balance, we need to make sure that managed care and/or other healthcare organizations don't somehow constrain our
can't
choices.
Carry out decisions like that one was trying to do.
Our choices by saying, yes, you can get the test, but if it's positive, you've got to do only the choice that we select.
Yeah. There is a lot of movement of saying people are responsible for their health needs in many circumstances, and so they need to be held accountable for the consequences of having caused those health needs. An advertisement, we're holding a conference at Harvard last Thursday and Friday of April, I forget what the dates are, on responsibility for health. If you're interested, you're welcome to come. But notice that I think this is a harder case to apply that to than most others. Most other kinds of cases are cases where I don't do things that would be good for my health, or I do things that are bad for my health. I smoke, or I drink too much, or I don't exercise, or I eat a bad diet. And then I suffer the consequences. And then we can say to me, well, look, it's your problem. You deal with it because you brought this on yourself and you knew what you were doing, et cetera, et cetera. These cases, as I said to Mark, are different because the person suffering the consequences and needing the health care is not the one who made the decision, it's the child. And so it's much more problematic to try to use that responsibility judgment to deny services to the child, who presumably again has the same kind of moral status that and so claims on resources that the rest of us have. But it nevertheless is the case that this is a threat, and there is fairly widespread interest, not just in this country, in thinking about people's responsibility for health and using that line of argument to deny services. West Virginia Medicaid is experimenting with, they got waivers for a new plan which would reduce the core benefits for the Medicaid recipients, and then you sign a contract to do various things that are good for your health, and to come in and get checkups and so forth and so on, and then if you do that you get more services. You get a higher benefit package. That's an indication of the interest in this. And of course, if you think about the debate about obesity, another example, it's replaced smoking as the bad thing that people do. Steve?
I want to talk about the expressivist argument for a moment, because I think there's something quite weird about defending this selection in terms of free speech. And my reasoning for that is that I'll talk about free speech as a right. Ann Coulter has a right to say anything she wants about John Edwards, but I can think of her as a evil, hate-filled, bad person for doing so, right? So if you defend this in terms of free speech, you really haven't necessarily provided a moral defense of it. You have the right to say certain things, even though it would be wrong to do so. And taking that example as a to a step further, and part of the objection to what she said was simply that certain words have meaning that is damaging, regardless of intent, regardless of anything. That certain language, certain speech acts have intents that cannot have effects that
consequences,
cannot be avoided. So, couldn't somebody with the disability rights, or couldn't somebody claim that this is nevertheless a negative act by your choice of PGD or post-conception abortion and so on? You are implying that, maybe not implying that it's wrong to have a child like this, but you're implying that it's perfectly okay to choose not to have a child like this, that is an acceptable thing to do, and that maybe is a negative thing, regardless of intent.
Yeah, okay. So to repeat the question, it was a worry about appealing to a right to free expression because right to free expression protects us in saying all kinds of things that it's bad for us to say or that we shouldn't have said. And so this wouldn't be a grounds. It would if it had an objectionable message, it would still be criticizable. I basically want to agree with what you say. I was using, at the point at which I looked at the right to reproductive freedom and the right to free expression, I was asking, let's assume the message is what the critics say it is. And that it is an offensive message, would it be the case that that is a sufficient ground for prohibiting the practice which carries that message? And so just as the right to reproductive freedom protects women making choices that we think are morally criticizable for other reasons, but nevertheless it protects their right to do so as a matter of legal and public policy, I think as a matter of morality as well. And the same thing with regard to free expression. So the claim there was only that this wouldn't be, the expressivist objection wouldn't be a sufficient grounds for prohibiting the practice. It would still enable us, as you correctly say, to criticize the choice that someone made. Now, the other half of my response to that would be, I then went on to say, well, what is the message implied? And to suggest that it wasn't an objectionable message, though it certainly is the case that some people mistakenly draw an objectionable implication. And then we have to worry about the harms that may come from that. So I think we're not in disagreement. Yes, sir?
Back to the harm problem. It seems like I think the argument that selection uses certain people as means to social goods was a bit too quick. I'm not sure who is harmed in your argument. If, in the first place, if it's, and I think also I'm concerned about where in the process the selection is being done, because it determines changes who's harmed.
Right.
So if it's when there's already a fetus in existence and you do a test for Down syndrome and you find that it's positive and you select on that basis, then it's not clear to me that you can say that the fetus is harmed.
No, I agree.
I know you weren't.
Yeah, right.
But if you don't select on that basis, it's not clear to me that the future person is harmed, because it's not clear to me that anybody that it's
This is the non-identity problem.
right, exactly.
Yeah.
And so the question then is who's harmed to serve other?
Or for the sake of who are you doing this would be a way of, I think, also asking the same question you're asking. Let me speak to that. I have written about that elsewhere, but so I'm happy to speak to it. Why is it the case? Suppose that the woman tests for Down syndrome or blindness, something that you think does make the child's life worse. And she learns that the child will have that condition and doesn't test for it. Or go back to the case I started the whole discussion with, that woman who doesn't wait 2 months, doesn't take and her child is born seriously retarded. Has the child been harmed? And the first answer is no, because that child, if she had waited, taken the medicine, she would have given birth to a different child. So the child who would be born seriously retarded, that's the only possible life it could have had. Just as the child who already has the condition for Downs, it only has the option of existing with that condition or not existing at all. And for almost all the cases we're talking about, the conditions aren't so serious that they make life, from the person's standpoint, not worth living. So the question is not giving someone, it's not clear why we should think it harms someone to give them a life, say, with Down syndrome, as opposed to giving them no life at all. So who's harmed? And if no one's harmed, who's wronged? And if no one's wronged, what wrong has been done? The short answer to that is that I think we need to, this is called the non-identity problem in the literature, as first identified by Parfit and has been worked on by lots of others. No one has fully solved it to their satisfaction, much less everyone else's satisfaction. But what it shows is that our ordinary notion of harm is, if I harm David, I perform some action now that makes David worse off than he would have been had I not performed that action. And so we look at the very same person before my potentially harmful action and afterwards and see whether they have been made worse off. That's a same person judgment. And that's a feature of our standard notion of harming. And so what I've argued and what some of others have argued is that we need to abandon an exclusive understanding of harming as requiring that the same person be looked at before and after. So what in fact happens in many of the selection cases is where there's where that woman who gets the test for Down syndrome aborts that child and then seeks to have, quote, a normal child instead. There, if we want to still think of it as harm prevention, it's prevention by substitution. It's by substituting one child for another child. So we lose that standard feature of our understanding of harm, that it's the same person. So what one needs is, in my view, what are called non-person affecting principles. Now, others have tried to say that we can still wrong people even if we don't make them worse off, all things considered. The racist airline clerk who denies a ticket to a black person because he is prejudiced against them, and then the plane crashes. Well, that person's better off, but we can say they've still been wrong. So there's a number of moves that can be made here.